This is CRM Audio, the Microsoft Dynamics CRM podcast, with George Dubinsky, Joel Lindstrom, and Sean, the CRM Hobbit Tabor.
CRM Audio, the Dynamics CRM podcast, is sponsored by KingswaySoft. They offer robust error handling and superior performance to streamline your development process and increase productivity. Their dynamic CRM tools simplify integration development work with easy-to-use development and scheduling processes. With their SSIS toolkit, your data integration can happen quickly and automatically so you don't have to worry about out-of-date records. The ultimate goal of the toolkit is to simplify data integration development work. By utilizing SSIS as your data integration platform, you can take advantage of the flexibility and power of SSIS ETL engine, which enables integration with virtually any application or data source that you may need to work with. We thank KingswaySoft for their support of CRM Audio.
Joining us now is Scott Durow. Scott is with Develop One, and Scott is the famous developer of the Ribbon Workbench. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you.
Scott is here because it's one of our favorite tools for CRM. Back in the day when the Ribbon came out in CRM 2011, it was great because Microsoft introduced this great framework, but they released a developer framework through the SDK. And once you got into there, it was very technical. Only people who had a deep stomach for doing things like XML editing and that type of thing, could do it. But then quickly, Scott came along with the Ribbon Workbench. And the Ribbon Workbench is, as I mentioned, along with things like the XRM Toolbox, one of the gotta-have add-ons for CRM.
Yeah, that's a good introduction. Thank you for that. Yeah.
What inspired you to make the Ribbon Workbench?
Well, I mean, you just describing there back in the day. So I was on the TAP for 2011, and it was all very exciting. Having seen the Ribbon, obviously in SharePoint for a while, and then seeing it being moved into Dynamics CRM, it was really good to see it there. And then you start to look at it, as you say, you've got to edit this XML and you've got to download it and you've got to start to change it. And it was a bit of trial and error. And because of back on the TAP, there wasn't really very much documentation. So yeah, we all just started to download this XML and poke around and see what we could do. And some of the things were quite surprising. And I think, well, I was convinced. I remember telling someone when I was describing to one of my developers, they're saying, "Oh yeah, don't worry. Yeah, Microsoft, they'll definitely produce a tool to be able to edit this because we can't have this as just XML." So I was really holding up hope that there was going to be some fancy UI for editing it eventually. But then, obviously, as it transpired, nothing came along. And even on the TAP, I created a command line tool to start to do basic stuff like adding buttons and things, because I just found that people were editing it and creating all sorts of artifacts, some of which were displaying and some of which weren't displaying. And so you download the XML and look what was there, and it was very difficult to unpick. So I started to trying to standardize the process of just doing simple things, really, just like adding a button to call a piece of JavaScript. Yeah, and the Ribbon Workbench was probably a natural progression from that. As I realized that this fancy UI was not going to materialize, I thought, well, I better put some UI on top of this command line tool. And I'd been doing a lot of stuff with Silverlight, and so Silverlight was the natural choice for me because it gave us the ability to do something that was quite advanced in the user interface and drag and drop and the like. And I also wanted to put it inside Dynamics because I had held hope for having some part of the actual native user interface. I wanted it to be there. I wanted it to be very easy for people just to go into the solution area and just start to edit the command bar, the Ribbon as it was back then, just in the same way as they might edit any form or something like that. So Silverlight was the natural choice there.
You mentioned that you developed a Ribbon Workbench because tools from Microsoft were not there, and you needed a tool to deal with the complexities of Ribbon diff-XML. In the process, you shot yourself and other developers in the foot.
what you mean, because as Joel said,
Because when I talked privately to some of the Microsoft guys, and I said, "Look, guys, are you ever going to release a formal, official tool?" And I said, "Look, we did have an item on the backlog, but that's got pushed out because now you have Ribbon Workbench."
yeah.
So whatever they had on their backlog got completely removed, or priority 100.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose you can see that in lots of different ways, but personally, I feel quite proud about that, because I would hope that they would be able to then take that development effort and use it to do something that's going to make Dynamics great from a end user's perspective. I think, if I've contributed in terms of being able to make another feature greater by the work that I did, then yeah, that makes me feel pretty good, I think.
That seemed to be for a while there in the 2011 era. There seemed to be kind of a intentional choice to add this great XRM power, but limit what they made available through the front end to give developers the tools to extend, which was fantastic. But in some of the things that they did with Fetch and some of the other stuff, they it was like there was this other world that you couldn't get to unless you were a developer. Things like, I'm thinking also that's when they expanded out the synchronization rules, but they never built the front end for that. And so that's where people like XRM Toolbox have come along and plugged those holes and made these things that were inaccessible to mortals like us. Made it easier for them to get there.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good approach in general, because what it enables you to do is to have that user interface to get you so far, so you can get the things that everyone needs to do very commonly on a day-by-day basis through the UI. But then where you do need to stretch it, you then obviously got the ability, and it's been something that Microsoft have been doing for a very long time, even with something like Visual Studio. There are some things in Visual Studio that you can do through the UI drag and drop, but then if you want to go a bit further, you have to then go and edit the code behind, or whatever it might be. But I think that the important thing is that the user interface then doesn't break when you go and change it. And I suppose that's probably the tricky thing with these things. If you take custom workflows, for example, which is something I've not really seen many people doing very much with, being able to download the XAML and edit it in Visual Studio and then re-upload. Of course, when you do that, then you stop being able to make edits through the user interface because that would break. So I suppose there's this balancing act between being able to make it flexible, but whilst also not then suddenly meaning that if you make an edit, you can no longer use those tools in the user interface.
Do you believe that a good developer who's, let's say, not specializes, but spends a lot of his time or her time doing command bar or ribbon customizations, do you think that using Ribbon Workbench is enough, or deep knowledge of Ribbon diff XML and how it all hangs together definitely is required?
Well, there's probably different levels. As you were saying in it was a couple of episodes ago about the different things you have to do, if you're just simply adding a button and linking it up to some JavaScript and maybe moving something and hiding something, I think those types of operations don't require any knowledge of the diff XML because the Ribbon Workbench makes it so easy to do. But I think there is a level at which by which if you're starting to be an ISV where you're creating customizations that are going to be pushed out to many different organizations, I think those kind of customizations you really do need to understand how that diff XML is layered, the implications of adding a button in a particular position, especially when you've got things like sequence numbers that you've only got a finite number of spaces between two other buttons. So those kind of considerations for an ISV, I think it is very important to understand the way in which it all hangs together. But for someone who's just doing customizations where they just need to run a dialogue or run a report or something straightforward like that from the button, I don't really think they need to understand. What do you think?
Look, it definitely helped for me to dig into some formal definitions But just for my understanding, what does it mean to enable or disable button versus showing or hiding the button, when one is applicable, when another one? And sort of you start reading between the lines and in documentation and trying to understand how it all works at runtime, how rendering of these works, and particularly how frequently JavaScript is called, what might be causing performance issues. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
If you put 7 buttons, each one of them in enable disable state, and this state is controlled by the JavaScript functions from 15 different modules, it's going to be a long wait till your command bar is rendered, right?
Yeah,
and
definitely.
it's every time it's refreshed. So
especially considering the sequential nature of those calls, and I've always tried to push out as much information through, well, my blog, as also through the user voice, the Ribbon Workbench user voice site, to try and give people some information around that, because the SDK is exactly as you say. You do have to read between the lines or do some poking around and actually using the browser F12 to try and see what's going on. Some of the things that as you say, are a consideration aren't really documented anyway. So that's probably been one of my key focuses around my blog for a while, and the user voice site, is to try and give people that information so they can make those right decisions. But I think on the whole, the types of solutions that you'd be building that have to consider those are the kind of really high-end complex stuff, certainly in my experience anyway. A lot of the time, people are about saying, well, how can we make the user's life simpler? So moving a button to be more closer to the left-hand side, or just making a shortcut for something. Those are the kind of things I see a lot of people doing, and it does seem to make quite a lot of difference to the users as well. I think users appreciate those kind of tweaks, if you like. My mission, I suppose, is to try and make it easier for people to make their dynamic CRM solutions work better for their end users.
And then the other big shift then was with the next release with 2013, when Microsoft decided, with good reason, the ribbons were too complicated, and went to the new command bar with, I don't know what the total number they cut out, but they had to cut out at least 25 to 30% of the buttons.
Yeah.
And everybody flipped out and was having heart attacks. Well, where's my mail merge button, and where's the run report button on forms? And you were the one that quickly realized, hey, all that stuff is still there. They just hit it with display rules.
Yes.
And making that, I don't know how many times I've used that, for example, where people were uncomfortable with the new social pane and the way the quick forms weren't configurable, and I was able to say, well, I can take this Ribbon Workbench, show the old create phone call button, and hide the social pane, and you're good.
And I think there is still a lot of people doing that kind of stuff still today after that cull. And it's interesting because there was a significant cull, as you say earlier on. They hit an awful lot of buttons, and then of course restricted the number of buttons that were visible on the command bar until you go into the overflow. So also then moving stuff, because a lot of people say, oh, well, I don't want it to be in the overflow. I'd rather it to be on that top 5, on those first 5, and then of course it increases up to 7 and then 9, and so yeah, that's another common use of the Ribbon Workbench. And of course that move to the command bar also introduced somewhat of a dilemma in the naming of the tool, being called the Ribbon Workbench, which is what everyone identifies with. Suddenly, well, actually now we're editing the command bar, so it's not really a ribbon.
Right.
Although there is the ribbon still there on the non-refreshed entities, etc. But a lot of people say, well, why are you still calling it the Ribbon Workbench? And my stock answer to that is, well, it's the Ribbon XML Workbench, but it's got like...
You still have the ribbon diff section, and but it's this weird disconnect, though, when you go into customization mode, how the navigation bar and the ribbons still display in the old style, and then they're rendered in the new style. So the ribbon isn't dead; it's still there under the covers.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a different visualization of the ribbon. So the command bar is the ribbon, but just in disguise.
I remember
anyway.
I remember when I first came upon the Ribbon Workbench, I simultaneously was your biggest fan, and you were also my arch enemy. because right before that, I had spent hours and hours going through the XML to update a ribbon to launch a dialogue, and I only found the ribbon workbench after I was done. So one of
my sincerest apologies.
well, one of my colleagues says because I needed to tweak it a little bit, and I said I don't have time right now. I got to do these other things. He goes, well, let me see if I can help. And then like 10 minutes later, he comes back. Here you go. I go, how'd you do that fast? He goes, well, weren't you using Ribbon Workbench? I go, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm so angry. I'm like,
well, and I started to think if you hadn't written that and all the people making the 23rd change from 2011 to later versions, where they do depend on those buttons, Microsoft would have had a lot more unsatisfied customers if it wasn't there. My other favorite little feature in it is the feature you've added to reset the ribbon to the default, or the ability, again, using your tool to reset a ribbon to the default when you just screw it up. Having that, and again, clients do that, or you have overly complex customization or upgrading, you want to do away with the stuff. Just an easy way to let's reset it back to normal.
Well, it's. I think the actual way that the ribbon has been implemented is pretty elegant when you look at it. Because that concept of layering that we're all familiar with solutions, where you've got that managed layer or multiple managed layers, and then maybe an unmanaged layer on top of it, is exactly the same structure that they've used with the ribbon XML. But it actually provides an ability to add in changes at each of those different levels, and so you create a little copy of a piece of that XML. I suppose it's imagine if you had the ability to do that right down at the form XML level, because we're all used to adding stuff and removing things from forms, but that sometimes gets a little bit difficult with that managed unmanaged layering. But with Ribbon XML, because everything is done down at that kind of lowest level, so at the button level, or the group level, or the command level, you've really got a lot of power over what you customize and what you don't customize. And the great thing is if you want to revert stuff back to that managed layer, you just literally delete everything. And so I do get a lot of people talking to me, raising tickets on user voice, the Ribbon Workbench user voice site, and saying, oh yeah, I've done this and this, or one of my developers done something, and we don't know what to do. We want to get rid of it, and I just say, well, just delete the stuff, and it'll all go back. So yeah, it's pretty neat in the way it works.
The one thing that I did come across, one of the problems I've come across, is we were dealing with legacy code, let's call it that we inherited from other developers. And I was trying to understand what they've done with the buttons, and I went in and I see disable button and I enable button and I try to remove and just wouldn't work. And then there was a third-party solution and I tried to remove that and it couldn't remove because of dependence. Anyway, long story short, I ended up just ripping out ribbon diff XML completely. And turns out that ISV solution injected a couple buttons into the ribbon. It was opportunity entity, but that was just one, right? Then I took it from there, and nice customizations, everything worked. But how often do you find that, let's say you put 1, 2, 3, 4 solutions, each one of them includes their own buttons, how they compete for this limited space on command bar?
Yeah, definitely. I do see people raising tickets in the user voice sometimes where that scenario has happened, and I think it's a limitation of the ribbon diff XML with the integer sequence numbers. That's fundamentally the problem. There is that although the sequence numbers of the core ribbon is like 10, 20, that basically means you've only got 11 to 19 spaces for your custom buttons. So, and that's fine, but of course people are more likely to position it at like 15. And so if you start putting two buttons and you give it the same sequence, you're going to start to have overlaps, which is why I think for ISVs, for people who are creating managed solutions, Those kind of things are important to understand, so that they don't end up having collisions with other ISVs, and that's why something like creating your own group is always a good idea for an ISV, because then you don't end up with this problem with that group is going to have its own unique set of spaces.
True. I think what would have helped is if there was some level of control when I import a solution from ISV, and they have their buttons, let's say 15, 16, 17 on the ribbon, and I would have a control. I would say, hey, look, I know you're trying to squeeze in here, but I already have the buttons. How about you move to the right and I maintain your sequence? Very similar to the option sets, right? You've got your own unique starting point and be done with it, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's funny because we've now got the command bar rendering of the ribbon, and a lot of the complexity of the ribbon diff XML comes from the dynamic scaling that we used to have with the ribbon rendering. So, where you shrink your window and you get some of the groups, they go down to a different template that has smaller buttons in rows, in columns, sorry. Or then it goes to the overflow button. And so the complexity of creating a template that would then have the facility for specifying the behavior when you shrink the available space of the ribbon required quite a lot of complexity in terms of how you describe the buttons in those different groups. But now that we have the command bar, all of that complexity has gone away. So I'm quite interested to see where we're going to go with that, because in a sense we've gone right back to do you remember the old isv.config?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah,
Good
where you just have a
old-
list of buttons that appears, and because that's really what we've got now, is that say, well, there's a particular position, and then you just got a list of buttons that can appear in that position, and it would probably have to honor the same sort of ordering as you might get with the layering of a form, for example. So it's the previous, the layering, it's like the most recent one gets added on to the previous sequence. So I think the fact that we have got ribbon XML still is interesting, because I can't help but feel that there must be some point in the future where that ribbon XML becomes more of a hindrance, and maybe there needs to be an evolution into the next phase to make it simpler to manage those buttons.
Well, as long as we still have entities which are not, which haven't been updated.
Yeah, the non-refresh stuff. Yeah.
So let's talk about what's new. You mentioned you built it on Silverlight, and as most of our listeners probably know, Silverlight is not something that Microsoft is continuing. It's been abandoned and replaced with better things.
My heart bleeds.
It's been sent across the Rainbow Bridge.
I'm gonna shed a tear if you're not careful. You're being so poetic.
As my colleague Captain Red Lace Scott Sewell would say, it's gone to live in a farm in the country.
I tell you what, I held out so long for Silverlight. I was clinging on there. I was that person just hanging onto someone's knees and saying, "Please don't go," just making a fool of myself because I loved it so much. But
it had a good shot. If you remember, a decade ago or so, they broadcast the entire Olympics with Silverlight. Netflix originally used Silverlight, and so it had some good stuff going for it. But then mobile happened, and you kind of got caught up in the backlash against Flash. Well, Flash was king. It was a viable competitor to it, but with the idea of having a plug-in to stream video and that type of thing going away, it has moved on.
Yeah, and like you say, yeah, we've moved on. Things have changed. The landscape's changed. Cross-browser, HTML5, all of those things that have really created a considerable shift. And I suppose back when we had in update rollup 12 on 2011, where it suddenly became cross-browser, I think that was when the writing was on the wall. because obviously the challenges of creating that kind of level of sophistication of a plugin across every browser and making it consistent is always going to be a challenge. And I suppose that's why Flash has demised as well, and we've moved on. But I mean, I was a massive fan, and the MVVM model view model pattern was probably, when I think back on it, well, that's what I was the fan of. I was a fan of the ability to create that separation, to create have C# code, and then that data binding mechanism in the UI with responsive UI, just simply by binding it to your view model, and then all the testability that comes with. So looking back, it wasn't specifically Silverlight that I was wed to. It was more the productivity that kind of framework gives. And really, back then there was no other way of doing that. And the idea of doing it in HTML and JavaScript, well, just sort of sent shivers down my spine to create that kind of level. Even with jQuery and everything, it would just have been a real nightmare. And the move to HTML and back when we started to see the Silverlight, the move away from Silverlight, I started this kind of journey in terms of saying, well, if I was to rewrite the Ribbon Workbench in HTML and JavaScript, what would I need? What tools would I need to do that, such that it wasn't going to be such a difficult task that I wouldn't be able to maintain it going forwards, or it was just never going to work? And that's where my other project, Sparkle XRM, was born. Was very much in a response to thinking, well, what do I need to build something as sophisticated as the Ribbon Workbench, but just using that HTML JavaScript paradigm?
I have to raise my hand up and disagree that cross-browser support was the reason for the Silverlight demise. If anything, Silverlight did help cross-browser compatibility, but making it easier to develop.
That's true.
So I think I can't help myself but wonder if Silverlight at some point was open sourced. Would that help to keep it alive, or it was just a matter of time because primary functions like video rendering and the reason why it was created, well, deep down the reason was to knock out Flash, right?
Well, I think that was obviously the original idea, but I think they quickly reined in that ambition and moved it to the rich internet applications paradigm, saying, well, Silverlight is about creating business apps that have a rich user interface rather than it being a direct competitor for Flash. I think the Silverlight team realized quite quickly that they were a bit on a hiding to nothing if they tried to do that. But certainly in the early days, I think you're right.
I don't know. Is asynchronous pattern was a problem? What's the problem? Or is it because tools develop in HTML and JavaScript evolve? HTML5 has support for video. In fact, we recording this podcast using raw HTML. Zencaster has built-in support using HTML. It's not even a script.
It's awesome, isn't it? Yeah, and it's a standard and a cross-browser standard, and ultimately, I think that's where things like Silverlight always run into these problems. Is that it would have never been a standard that could then be implemented across. It's not only across browser, of course, it's also across platform. So iPads and iOS devices and Apple OS X devices and Linux and all the various different OSs that you may be running the browsers on. If it's not a standard, it almost makes that an impossible task, because it would then require Microsoft to actually build Silverlight to work on all those devices and keep up with the various releases. I mean, we obviously get so many different flavors of Android that would be an impossible task, I think.
Yeah, but that's what I said about open sourcing. And speaking of open source, like you've done a lot of open source development. Well, Sparkle XRM to start is open source. Then you've got quite a few samples on MSDN code library, I believe.
Yeah.
Now, with the open source development, how would you say, like, for people who start contributing, there's so much variety. I can put my code on Codeplex, I can use GitHub, I can use Bitbucket, I can make a sample for code library on MSDN. Which one would I choose? Where to contribute? Like, if I have a piece of code I want to share, where would you say I should go?
Well, I think it's probably, well, certainly that I found in my experience that there's two types of open source development profiles, if you like. One is where you find a library that you really like and you want to start using, and in the process of starting to use that, you then want to contribute to that and develop it further. So that scenario is you're bound to whatever platform was used by the original author of that library. But of course, the second is if you've created something and authored something yourself, and then you want to make it open source. From my own experience, that second scenario is usually a follow-on from you starting to contribute something in the first place. So you get to grips, you understand the zen of open source, and you kind of think, this is really cool, this is amazing that we're all working on this together and moving forwards much quicker than any one person could do. And so you already have, if you like, a favorite platform because you've been doing that, and then inevitably you end up using the same platform that you've been contributing to launch your own projects. So I don't know if there is a best platform. Certainly my preferred platform is GitHub, but yeah, I think it's very personal. I think that favoritism comes from where your experiences lied in the past and how you got involved with open source projects.
Well, it seems to be personal preference of majority of the developers these days. I see a lot of projects being moved from Codeplex to GitHub.
Well, it's got such a rich set of features in there, and it's so collaborative and so social. I think that's what I like about it, and you do get a feeling as if you're part of something. I think for me, that's what differentiates it from something like Codeplex. You really
I have to say, if Codeplex goes down for an hour, people say, meh. When GitHub goes down for 5 minutes, it's a storm out there.
Yeah, definitely.
You know about it.
It's kind of like if Facebook goes down, right? There's a massive outcry, and
yeah,
I've mentioned this to people in the past. Is that I see GitHub as like the Facebook of coders. That's what it feels like to me. I feel like I'm a part of something, and I want to contribute to it and communicate with other people in GitHub. It's a place that I want to be, whereas other tools around are just simply places to put code, which I think there's quite a big difference between them.
So what is the status of the new release? Is it available now, or will it be available soon?
Well, I have it in private beta at the moment, so I've got a few select people that don't mind having lots and lots of bugs to go through, and so they're doing testing, and I'm certainly hoping to get it into public beta, certainly within the next couple of months, and so it's completely rewritten into HTML JavaScript. Uses Sparkler XRM. It doesn't actually require the Sparkler XRM library to be installed separately, so it all comes bundled inside the Ribbon Workbench solution. But it should be a case of just being able to upgrade to the new version. I've done some new changes in the way the UI works, so I've responded to some feedback that I've had over the years, and also just from my own use as well. Some of the things that used to frustrate me because again, it probably was a little bit of a selfish exercise in writing the Silverlight version, just simply because I needed it for my project. So I'm a big Ribbon Workbench user myself. So I've obviously had gripes, as I'm sure other people have, in terms of usability. So I've tried to work on that. For example, you can now create commands. So you don't have to go into separate nodes to add actions and things like that. It's all just in a single design surface, and it looks kind of like when you're designing a business process flow. So you've got like a hierarchical layered approach, and you can drag and drop steps up and down and add OR groups, etc., just on a single design, rather than having the property editor window, which was more like a Visual Studio type environment.
What's your development environment like? What do you use? And how does it stack up against your Silverlight environment, where you had a lot of things given to you and sort of drag and drop, and you had your XAML editor and what's not? How are you coping with moving to bare bones JavaScript? I know you've got Sparkle XRM, which requires tools as well. So what do you use? Do you use TypeScript? Do you use third-party libraries? Do you use third-party development environments or assistance libraries or something like that? What is it like?
So are you talking about JavaScript, HTML?
Yeah, the new version. Yeah, we passed Silverlight. So.
Well, I exclusively use Sparkle XRM, so with Script Sharp. So I don't use TypeScript.
So you use Script Sharp, not TypeScript.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an interesting debate, and that probably we could go for another hour or so talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But I think for me, TypeScript, I do like TypeScript, and I have used it in non-Dynamics projects. Script Sharp has always been, I've always felt a much closer fit for doing dynamic CRM development, not least because dynamic CRM JavaScript is written in Script Sharp anyway. That's what the product team use. If you look at the JavaScript, you can see it's all Script Sharp JavaScript.
I thought it's TypeScript. That was
the core JavaScript is all you can see it. It's got the Script Sharp libraries. It's not the.
I see.
Yes, they've got their own branch, I think, because it's not exactly the same as the open source one. But so yeah, that was the natural. That was one of the natural reasons I chose in the first place. But it solves a different problem for me. I think it's not something that can be compared directly to TypeScript, because with TypeScript is about improving JavaScript. TypeScript is about saying, what are the failures of JavaScript? What are the problems that it causes with its very loose way of having a syntax and lack of object orientation, etc. So TypeScript is about plugging those and improving the JavaScript language, whereas Script Sharp is about saying, we don't want to write JavaScript. We want to write in C# and use all of the goodness that you get with Visual Studio, be able to have a much more consistent experience writing dynamic CRM code across both the server and the client, and in fact to be able to share code as well. I do that quite a lot. So constants and resources, resource files, string literals, etc. I'll share those across plugins and JavaScript by the fact that I can do that through just linked files within Visual Studio using Script Sharp. And for development teams, it's certainly true that the average profile, if you like, of a dynamic CRM development team is there's usually people that are developers that are more familiar with that C# plugin style of coding. And so anything that I can do to make it easier and more consistent for them to write client-side code without having to have a load of UI HTML5 experts, I find that increases productivity of the team, because the people that then are writing plugins can then also be the same people that are writing the HTML that runs in the browser, and so that you can get the synergy between the client and server a lot more there. But yeah, I'm very pleased with it. and I'm getting some good feedback so far. So hopefully it'll see the light of day very shortly.
Okay. Okay, great. And you mentioned that it should be able to just upgrade the existing solution.
Yeah, exactly. So as far as functionality is concerned, the majority of the functionality from the old version is in the new version, with the one exception in that I made a decision because the ribbon, as we talked about, the command bar is just a different visualization of the ribbon. So I took the decision to only render the command bar view of that ribbon XML in the ribbon workbench. So in the Silverlight version, you've got two tabs. You've got the command bar tab and the old style ribbon. But in the new version, you just got one visualization design surface, which is the command bar design surface. And you can toggle to show controls that are only visible on the command bar, or the ones that are invisible on the ribbon as well. And that just makes it a little bit simpler, a bit more of a consistent UI. So now some of the functionality that you couldn't previously do on the command bar in the old version, like dragging new groups onto it, you can do that now in the new version. And then the second minor change is that I've removed the ability to add in new tabs, because tabs is something which the command bar doesn't have a need for. And I think probably people should avoid adding tabs, ribbon XML tabs anymore, because well, obviously it's not rendered unless you're looking at the non-refreshed entities. And also it means that you don't have that container, that top level container. So it's a lot easier to understand where it's going to appear in the command bar rendering.
Well, we're looking forward to this, and I've just realized that this will be the last remaining. This is the last remaining reason I have Silverlight installed on my computers. So as soon as I get that, I will have a ceremony where I remove Silverlight from my computers. I will always cherish my Silverlight plus XRM book by David Yak, partly because it's autographed, and also I'm in the acknowledgments because I believe I reviewed it or something. I will always keep this book. Probably will never look at it again, but I will always keep it.
When I first met David, I was awestruck, starstruck. I was like, wow, this is the great David Yak who wrote that book that I use all the time. So yeah, it's going to be certainly, a new era.
Besides being a Ribbon Workbench superhero, besides providing the world with the fantastic Ribbon Workbench, what else do you do?
I probably specialize in the development side of customizations, but and obviously with Sparkle XRM, a lot of my job is about creating an environment for a development team to quickly create customizations, custom UIs, such as editable grids or custom visualizations, where it's not going to be costly to maintain, and it's not going to create code that's going to be hard to maintain over time. So it's all about trying to reuse a framework and also create consistency. Because one of the things I often see in development teams where they don't have something like Sparkle XRM is you look at the code and everyone's got their own slightly different styles of doing things, and sometimes that can make it difficult to share common libraries, or and sometimes it can just mean that the amount of code that you end up writing is more than it maybe should be. So I do work with organizations to try and optimize that development process within their teams so that they can quickly respond to demands that their user base may have. Because obviously we all know and love Dynamic CRM from its the agility that it creates and that ability to just create new forms and new attributes really easily, and because the UI is just all handled for you. But then sometimes there's that last, I don't even want to say 20%, but that last 10, maybe 5% of functionality where you think, oh, well, if only we had this editable grid or this drag and drop thing or whatever it might be, it would mean that this whole solution would just be so much better and the users would love it so much more. So I want to make development teams be able to do that and have that agility from the custom UI perspective as well as from the configuration UI, so that their users really will love those solutions and ultimately adopt their CRM's environment a lot quicker and feel like that they're getting something that's just beyond just standard forms and views, etc. And
Exactly. I'm a big believer in editable grids, and users ask for it all the time. That was the one thing I thought we would have by now, because when I saw the opportunity stakeholders team that had the editable capability in it, I thought, oh, this is just the first step. It's coming. We've got the immersive Excel where you can bulk edit in Excel. So I still feel we're moving that way. So I think at some point we will get that capability in the product. But yeah, that's a great thing for a developer if you have especially a heavy data entry scenario. Putting an editable grid tool on it is a great thing to do.
And we've got the immersive Excel experience, so there's always that fallback back if that's suitable. So sometimes that immersive Excel where you can just edit a view and then just automatically submit it for update rather than having to download the spreadsheet and then re-upload it like you used to be able to do. Sometimes that's sufficient. But so I do have this somewhat of a dichotomy in my job, in that although I'm all about creating Sparkle XRM tools to make things quick to create custom user interface, I also spend a lot of my time persuading people not to do customizations.
Right.
Because it's all about that total cost of ownership, upgradability, etc., etc. So the way I try to describe it is, and the reason Sparkle XRM is called Sparkle is because it's that little bit of sparkle on a solution, and choosing what you're going to create custom needs to be about sparkle. It needs to be about something that really will make a difference to users, so that you're investing your time and your effort in something that's going to really drive adoption, etc., in the future.
How often people say, hey, I need a button to call a workflow, right? The inclination is people do it all the time, so why not to create a dialog within the ribbon workbench that allows you to pick the workflow and say, here's the button, run this workflow, or call this dialog, or whatever. You may have included that, but that's not the point. The point is create extensibility for the shortcuts. So people would be able to say, hey, look, here's the short way to add this XYZ functionality to your ribbon. Otherwise, you would have to go through the way of binding the library, doing the button, enabling, disabling, a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally on my wavelength, and so, and this is not something I've really talked to many people about, but on the roadmap for the Ribbon Workbench is two things that are on the same lines as that. So, firstly is smart buttons. So, and what a smart button is effectively a little template of Ribbon XML. So, a smart button has a button that you can drag onto the design surface, but then it also has a predefined command with a dialog template of the things that you can parameterize it. So think about it as code snippets in Visual Studio.
Yeah.
So the way I think about it is like that, where when you insert a code snippet, it puts the code there, and then you've got certain areas in that code where you can parameterize it. So it's the same notion. So your smart button would have a definition of a command, and it would say, well, these are the things that you can parameterize, and some of those parameters may be lookups to entities in Dynamic CRM, for example, a report or a workflow. So the test that I've been doing to test this idea out is to be able to run a dialog. And so you drag the run dialog button onto the design surface, and then up would pop a dialog that says, okay, select your dialog you want to run, enter the name that you want to call the button, give it an image, and then also an option to say, well, do you want this to run just fire and forget, or do you want there to be a task that is run after this dialogue has completed, such as refresh the form? That's quite a common one.
Brilliant.
Like
Looking
that.
forward to it.
And then the second area, which is on the same vein as you were talking about, which is the ability for other solutions to register a smart button of their own. So let's say you're an ISV and you publish some kind of quote configurator or something like that, and you want this functionality to be able to be used on a variety of maybe different custom entities or something like that. Well, you would then, in your solution, you'd be able to have a manifest file that the Ribbon Workbench would pick up, and then it would then include that smart button from that manifest inside the UI. So what that means is that the extensibility would be other ISVs would then say, well, if you want to add our functionality to some of your custom entities, well, rather than giving you instructions on how to bring up the Ribbon Workbench or edit the Ribbon XML, it just would have this manifest file in its solution that the Ribbon Workbench would then pick up and allow you just to simply drag the thing on and configure it through a dialogue.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Exactly. No, I like it. I've seen Sparkle. A lot of people saw your example code with the ability to do relationship visualization and how you made it look almost exactly like the image that you see when you log into CRM with the guy pointing his finger at the screen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, with a guy with a big finger.
I was wondering if that guy was actually you, Scott.
Well, if I get the call, I'd love to do the photo shoot. Someone. As long as I don't as long as it don't end up like the Getting Started lady. I'm sure the Getting Started lady, if anyone met her, they'd say, "It's you, the person that we can get rid of."
Well, Scott, thank you for joining us. If people want to follow you, your blog is develop1.net.
That's correct.
And that's also where they can get the Ribbon Workbench as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I hope to be putting up a post on that blog very shortly, saying where people can download the bits for the new version. And yeah, look forward to people using it and giving feedback and seeing how it goes from there.
Very cool.
And you're on Twitter, Scott Durow, correct?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. If you follow Scott Durow with 2 R's, you get somebody else.
Do you really?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. This has been CRM Audio, the Microsoft Dynamics CRM podcast. You can hear previous episodes on our website, crm.audio. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, follow us on Twitter at CRM Audio, or leave us a comment on our Facebook page, facebook.com/CRM podcast. If you have any topic suggestions or questions that you would like for us to answer on a future episode, please drop us an email at voice@crm.audio. Special thanks to Dale Simmons for our theme music. Go check out his website, dalesimmons.com. Please join us next time on CRM Audio.